Hi, my students. How are you all doing? So let's continue with our treasure chest, a collection of ICSE poems and short stories. We are going to do the short story today, which is called as The Elevator. It's given in your textbook on page number 146. So please open and let's start. Now today what I'm going to do is I'm going to first read the story with you because that is what this story requires, and then we shall read about the author, because only then you will be able to understand what has been said about the author. So we begin with the reading of the story first. Okay, and of course keep your pens in your hand because I will be dictating meanings to you so that you can write down the meanings as we go along while reading the text. Okay, The Elevator by William Sleater. It was an old building with an old elevator, a very small elevator which could carry only 3 people. Martin, a thin 12-year-old, felt nervous in it from the first day. He and his father moved into the apartment. Of course, he was always uncomfortable in elevators, afraid that they would fall. But this one was especially unpleasant. Mark the word, it is written especially, not specially. But this one was especially unpleasant. Perhaps this was because of the poor lighting and the dirty walls. Perhaps it was because of the door, which never stayed open long enough and slammed shut with a loud clanging noise. Perhaps it was the way the elevator shuddered each time it left a floor, as if it was exhausted. Maybe it was simply too small. It seemed crowded even with only 2 people in it. The stairs were no better. Martin tried them one day after school. There were no windows and the lights were not working. Martin's footsteps echoed behind him on the cement as though there was another person climbing, getting closer. By the time he reached his home on the 17th floor, he was gasping for breath. Martin's father worked at home. He wanted to know why Martin was out of breath. "Why didn't you take the elevator?" he asked, frowning at Martin. "You're not only skinny and weak and bad at sports," his face seemed to say, "but you're also a coward." After that, Martin always took the elevator. He would have to get used to it, he told himself, just like he got used to being bullied at school. But he didn't get used to it. He was always afraid that it would suddenly stop and he would be trapped inside it for hours by himself. But it wasn't much better when there were other passengers. He didn't like to be close to them. He also disliked the way people tried hard not to look at one another, staring at nothing. One morning, the elevator stopped at the 14th floor, and a fat lady got on. She was wearing an old green coat that ballooned around her. As she waddled into the elevator, Martin was sure he felt it sink under her weight. She was so big that her coat brushed against him, and he had to squeeze himself into a corner. There was no room for anybody else. The door closed quickly behind her, and instead of facing it, means facing the door, she turned around and stared at Martin. He looked at her for a moment. She had large, fleshy cheeks and no chin, just a huge mass of neck. Her blue eyes were tiny but sharp. They seemed to be boring into Martin's face. Martin looked away, but the woman didn't turn around. Was she still looking at him? He glanced at her quickly, then looked away again. She was still watching him. He wanted to close his eyes, but he wanted to turn around and stare into the corner. But how could he? The elevator creaked down to 12, then 11. The piggy eyes were still looking at him. She had to be crazy. Why else would she stare at him like this? What was she going to do next? She did nothing. She only watched him, breathing loudly until the elevator reached the first floor at last. Martin wanted to run past her to get out, but there was no room. He could only wait as she turned and moved slowly out into the lobby. Then he ran. He didn't care what she thought. He ran nearly all the way to school. He thought about her all day. Did she live in the building? He had never seen her before, and the building was not very big. Maybe she was visiting somebody. But 7:30 in the morning was too early for visiting. Martin felt nervous when he got back to the building after school. But why should he be afraid of an old lady? He felt ashamed of himself. He pressed the button and stepped into the elevator, hoping that it would not stop. But it stopped. This time on the third floor. Martin watched the door slide open, revealing a green coat, a piggish face, and blue eyes which were already staring at him as if she knew he would be there. It wasn't possible. It was like a nightmare. But there she was. Going up, said Martin, his voice little more than a squeak. She nodded and stepped on. The door slammed. He watched. Her pudgy hand moved towards the buttons. She pressed not 14th, but 18th, the top floor. The elevator trembled and began to go up. The fat lady watched him. This morning, she got on at the 14th floor. So why did she get on at the third floor today to go up to the 18th? The elevator seemed to be moving more slowly than usual. Martin wanted to press 7 so that he could get out and walk up the stairs. But he couldn't reach the buttons without touching her, and he didn't want to do that. When the elevator stopped on his floor, she hardly moved out of his way. He had to squeeze past her, rubbing against her horribly scratchy coat. He was afraid the door would close before he could get out. She turned and watched him as the door slammed shut. Now she knows I live on the 17th, he thought. Have you ever noticed a strange lady in the elevator? He asked his father that evening. Can't say I have, he replied, not looking away from the television. Martin knew he was probably making a mistake, but he had to tell somebody about the woman. She was in the elevator with me twice today. She just kept staring at me. She never stopped looking at me for a minute. What are you so worried about now? His father said, turning impatiently away from the television. What am I going to do with you, Martin? Honestly, now you are afraid of some poor old lady. I am not afraid. You are afraid, said his father. When are you going to grow up and act like a man? Are you going to be timid all your life? Martin didn't want to cry in front of his father, so he waited until he got to his room. His father probably knew he was crying anyway. He slept very little. In the morning, when the elevator door opened, the fat lady was waiting for him. Martin stood there, unable to move, and then he backed away. As she saw him, her expression changed. She smiled as the door slammed. Martin started running down the stairs. The stairs were dark and he fell. His father was silent on the way to the hospital, disappointed and angry with him for being a coward and a fool. Martin had broken his leg and needed to walk on crutches. He could not use the stairs now. Was that why the fat lady had smiled? Did she know what would happen? At least his father was with him in the elevator on the way back from the hospital. There was no room for the fat lady to get in, and even if she did, his father would see her and maybe he would then understand. When he got home, he could stay in the apartment for a few days. The doctor said he had to rest as much as possible. Martin felt quite safe from the fat lady. Oh, I almost forgot. His father reached out and pressed number 9. What are you doing? Asked Martin, trying not to sound afraid. I promised to visit Mrs. Ullman, said his father, looking at his watch as he stepped out of the elevator. Let me go with you. I want to visit her too, Martin pleaded, struggling to move on his crutches. But the door was already closing. Afraid to be in the elevator alone? Said his father. Grow up, Martin. The door slammed shut. Martin hobbled to the buttons and pressed 9. But it didn't do any good. The elevator stopped at 10, where the fat lady was waiting for him. She moved in quickly, and he was too slow to get past her in time to get out. The door closed, and the elevator began to move. Hello, Martin, she said, and laughed and pushed the stop button. So that was the story. Now let's read about the author. William Sleater was an American science fiction author. The theme of family relationships is frequently intertwined with the science fiction plotline. In the short story The Elevator, the author explores the theme of irrational fears of childhood in contrasting characters of a sensitive boy with an insensitive father. It clearly shows the greater pressure exerted upon boys to be strong, brave, and not to cry. Martin probably has claustrophobia, as his greatest fear is being trapped in the lift. This is a very important point to note, especially nowadays when we are talking about, giving women an equal chance and everything. It's not only that the women were subjected to inequality. It was even the boys, even the males who were subjected to inequality because they were taught in those times that you are not supposed to cry, you are supposed to be strong, you don't have a right to show your emotions. So that point also can be noted over here. It exerted pressure upon the boys to be strong, brave, and not to cry. Martin probably has claustrophobia, as his greatest fear is being trapped in the lift. It takes a close look at the psyche of a child and offers an insight into a frightening world. Now, I have added one line over here. Martin struggles with his fear of elevators, trying to overcome it. The harder he tries, the firmer his fear gets and takes the form of a large woman. Martin struggles with his fear of elevators, trying to overcome it. The harder he tries, the firmer his fear gets and takes the form of a large woman. Full stop. He wants to avoid her, comma. He wants to avoid her, but encounters her every time he uses the elevator. So continue. The genre of horror fiction rears its eerie head as the story ends with Martin trapped in the elevator with a broken leg, unable to escape from the woman. Now that you have been introduced to the story, you would understand what exactly the author is trying to tell us. Okay. Let's begin with the explanation of the story. It was an old building with an old elevator, a very small elevator which could carry only 3 people. Martin, a thin 12-year-old, felt nervous in it from the first day he and his father moved into the apartment. So now we have the plot unfolding itself. Like I told you that a plot in literature, any plot in literature, whether it's a story or a drama or a novel, it should have particular points. I've explained this in one of my modules where I have done the plot of your earlier stories also. Okay, but I'll just repeat it for you. What is a plot? A plot is something where we have an exposition. Then we have, I did show this in my last module, but I'll show it to you all again. This is the meaning of a plot in literature. Okay, you can take a picture or you can copy it down. So that is the meaning of a plot. So the first thing is that we have an exposition, means an introduction to the setting and the characters of the story or novel or drama. So here we are introduced to Martin, and we are introduced to his father, and we are introduced to the setting. The setting is that of an elevator where the entire story takes place. It surrounds the elevator. So Martin, a thin 12-year-old, felt nervous in it from the first day he and his father moved into the apartment. Of course, he was always uncomfortable in elevators, afraid that they would fall, but this one was especially unpleasant. Perhaps this was because of the poor lighting and the dirty walls. Perhaps it was because of the door, which never stayed open long enough and slammed shut with a loud clanging noise. Okay, so you can imagine the elevator coming close, and then it's slamming shut, okay, with a loud clanging noise. Perhaps it was the way the elevator shuddered each time it left a floor, as if it was exhausted. Maybe it was simply too small. It seemed crowded even with only 2 people in it. So the elevator could actually hold 3 people, but even when there were 2 people in it, it seemed very crowded. Okay. So let's see what we note in this first paragraph. Like I told you, it begins with the exposition of the story. That means an introduction to the characters of the story and to the setting of the story. So that is what we have over here. Then we have what is the setting of the story? The elevator. And here we have a description of the elevator, which is in Martin's building. He has moved into another apartment with his father, and the building where he has moved is an old building, and therefore the lift is also old. The elevator is also an old one, and it's a very small one. We have the description given. A very small elevator which could carry only 3 people. And then perhaps this was then there was poor lighting, and it had dirty walls. Then it had a door which always slammed shut with a loud clanging noise. Then the elevator shuddered every time it left a floor, and it was simply too small. Okay, so this is a description of the elevator that we have over here. Then we have a description of the boy, the character of Martin. Okay, what is his character? That he is a small person, a small child who is only 12 years old. So he is also introduced to us. Continue. The stairs were no better. Martin tried them one day after school. There were no windows and the lights were not working. Martin's footsteps echoed behind him on the cement as though there was another person climbing and getting closer. By the time he reached his home on the 17th floor, he was gasping for breath. The meaning of gasping is breathing loudly with difficulty, trying to get more air. Breathing loudly with difficulty, trying to get more air. That is the meaning of gasping. So here we are introduced to his home. His home is on the 17th floor. And again we find that there is a description of the stairs which is given to us. That there were no windows and the lights were not working, and they were made of cement, and the footsteps echoed behind him on the cement as though another person was just climbing behind him and was getting closer and closer to him. So all this shows that Martin basically is a very meek person, and he's timid and he's very, very fearful. Not only of the elevator, we find that he is even fearful of the stairs, but probably that fear is a little less. So now in these 2 paragraphs, what do we notice? Apart from the description and the meanings which I've given you, we have the descriptions, but apart from that, we also come to know about the style which the author has used. He has used a lot of imagery. Okay, what is the imagery he has used? Do you know what is the meaning of imagery? You can write down the definition if you don't know. Imagery refers to words or phrases which are used to help the reader. Imagery refers to words or phrases which are used to help the reader to imagine the scene through the senses. For example, visual imagery makes you imagine through your eyes, through your sight, visual. Auditory imagery would be through your ears. Okay. And then of course we have smell, taste, touch, etc. I'm not touching on those because over here the author has used visual imagery and auditory imagery. Now, what are the examples of visual imagery over here? Where he is describing the lift, the elevator, which he has been described, that it was a very small elevator, then poor lighting, dirty walls, and it seemed crowded even with two people only. So this is visual imagery. Then the visual imagery used in describing the stairs, that there were no windows, there were no lights working, they were made of cement. So all that is the visual imagery of the stairs. Now, where has he used auditory imagery? Auditory imagery is when you can imagine through the sense of hearing. Okay. So what are the auditory imagery he has used? That the door of the elevator slammed shut. It's almost as if you can hear the slamming of a door with a clanging noise. Okay. Then every time it shuddered. So like it went rickety. So it could have been making a noise at that time also. Then the fact that he's saying that the Martin's footsteps echoed. So it's almost as if you could hear the echo of his own footsteps. So that is again auditory imagery. Okay. Martin's father worked at home. He wanted to know why Martin was out of breath. Now, this is probably Martin's father. By the time he reached the 17th floor and he reached home, he was literally gasping for breath. And because he was gasping for breath and his father was at home, probably his father was work from home. So he was gasping for breath. And as soon as his father saw him, his father frowned. What is the meaning of frowned? Looking angrily. So his father gave an angry look to Martin and said, "Why didn't you take the elevator?" He asked, frowning at Martin. "You are not only skinny and weak and bad at sports," his face seemed to say, "but you are also a coward." So here we find that the father has been introduced to us as an insensitive person because he looked angrily. Instead of being kind to the boy, he was just angry that why did you not take the elevator? So he asked very angrily. And look at the next sentence where the author has said his face seemed to say. I want you all to understand this word. Why did it seem to say? Because probably the author is trying to tell us that Martin assumed a certain thing. Martin imagined that his father was telling him, "You are skinny, weak, bad at sports, and you are also a coward." So this is Martin's assumption that his father is saying by looking at his face. His father has not actually said those words. Okay. He would have to get used to it, he told himself. So Martin is now speaking to himself that he would have to get used to using the elevator, just like he had got used to being bullied at school. So at school, so from here again we come to know that Martin is a meek child. So he tells himself that probably I'll have to start getting used to the elevator, just in the same way that other children at school bully me, and I have got used to their bullying. Like it makes no difference to me. Same way I have to start getting used to the elevator. But he didn't get used to it. He was always afraid that it would stop suddenly and he would be trapped inside it for hours by himself. So even though he had decided in his mind, he had told himself in his mind that he will get used to the elevator, he actually did not get used to it, because that fear was always there in him that someday the elevator would stop suddenly and he would be trapped inside it all by himself for many hours till someone came along. Okay. But it wasn't much better when there were other passengers. So apart from this fear of being alone in the elevator, he was also not very happy when there were other passengers in it. Why? Because the lift was very small. The elevator was very small. So he was not happy. He didn't like to be close to them. He also disliked the way people tried hard not to look at one another, staring at nothing. So what he did not like is that because the elevator was very small, people would stand very, very close to him. So he didn't like that. And also he did not like that once you got into the elevator, the other two people who would get in, they would keep looking at the walls and, sort of dream here and there, but would not look at each other. So he didn't like that. Now, one morning, the elevator stopped at the 14th floor and a fat lady got in. She was wearing an old green coat that ballooned around her. Ballooned means swollen out. So it ballooned. So sort of it swelled out. Okay, so it was swollen out. So swollen out in a spherical shape. You can write down that meaning. Ballooned means to swell out in a spherical shape. Okay, and she waddled into the elevator. What do you mean by waddling into the elevator? Walking in short steps. Walking with short steps and moving with weight of the body. Moving with weight of the body from one side to another. So she was waddling in, not that she was walking very aram se. She was like waddling, sort of, because she was fat. So she strolled in. Okay. As she waddled into the elevator, Martin was sure that it would sink under her weight. She was so big that her coat brushed against him, and he had to squeeze himself into a corner. There was no room for anybody else. Now, this lady was so fat that even though the lift could take 3 people, because she was so fat, there was no room for anyone else. The door closed quickly behind her, and instead of facing it, she turned around and stared at Martin. So now this woman who has gotten, she did not look at the door. Instead of looking at the door, she turned and she looked at Martin. Okay. Now that also Martin is afraid of. He does not like her looking at him. We have in the earlier sentence where the earlier paragraph where the author has told us that he disliked the way people tried hard not to look at each other. Now this old woman, this old fat woman is looking at him. That also he doesn't like. Okay, he's scared. Basically, it is his fear. So we have a description of the fat woman over here, okay? And the way she walked and everything and what she wore. Her dress was ballooned and she waddled into the elevator. All that you have to be able to describe. Now her description will follow in more detail. He looked at her for a moment. She had large fleshy cheeks. So her cheeks were fleshy and fat. And no chin. She had absolutely no chin because she was so fat that her throat, her neck joined her head. So there was no chin at all. And no chin, just a huge mass of neck. Her blue eyes were tiny but sharp. They seemed to be boring into Martin's face. Martin looked away, but the woman didn't turn around. Was she still looking at him? He glanced at her quickly and then looked away again. She was still watching him. He wanted to close his eyes. He wanted to turn around and stare into the corner. But how could he? There was just no place for him to turn also. The elevator creaked down to 12, then to 11. The piggy eyes were still looking at him. She had to be crazy. Why else would she stare at him like this? And what was she going to do next? So now we have this suspense created by the author that as if the woman is going to do something to Martin. Okay, this type of narration or this type of style is called as foreshadowing. It's a literary device which writers use, which is called as foreshadowing. 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 Foreshadowing means describing something in such a way so as to create a suspense in the mind of the reader as to what will happen next, or something eerie or something untoward is going to happen next. That is called foreshadowing. So that is what the writer has used over here. So we find the style of the writing of the narration, the style is not only has he used third person, because he starts with talking about Martin. So somebody else is reciting the story of Martin and his father and his fear and everything. So it is a third person narration. It's not first person, second person. Secondly, in the style we find that he has used a lot of imagery. The words are very simple, and he has also used foreshadowing. So this is all about the style of the writer or the author. Okay. So Martin looked away, but the woman, she did nothing. She only watched him, breathing loudly until the elevator reached the first floor. Martin wanted to run past her to get out, but there was no room. He could only wait as she turned and moved slowly out into the lobby. Then he ran. He didn't care what she thought. He ran nearly all the way to school. He was so terrified of her that he literally ran all the way to school. Not only her, in fact, he was terrified of having had to use the elevator. So he thought about her all day. We'll continue in my next module. I want you all to go through this entire module again so that you can understand the narration style that I have explained to you. How, because you might be asked a question on the style of writing. Okay, so what style has William Slater used? I've explained to you in my module. I want you all to go through it and try and understand what I've said till here, and we'll continue with the rest of the story in the next module.